Good evening, and welcome to the University of Cambridge's Senate House. I'm Debbie Prentice, the Vice Chancellor. The lecture that gathers us here is named after Sir Leslie Stephen, author, critic, historian, and ethicist. Leslie Stephen arrived in Cambridge in 1851, following in the footsteps of his older brothers. He matriculated at Trinity Hall to study mathematics. He graduated in 1854 and was, that same year, elected as a Fellow of the College. By one account, he was a skinny weakling who had become addicted to narrative poetry in early adolescence. This did not prevent him from taking up physical pursuits, including rowing. He was a poor oarsman, we are told, though apparently he became shockingly good at running down the path alongside the river, and at some point even held the Cambridge record for the mile. He was ordained while here, but controversies surrounding the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species led him to leave the clergy and to leave Cambridge. His real passion, perhaps understandably for someone who spent so long dwelling in the flatlands of East Anglia, was for mountaineering. He was an early president of the Alpine Society, and his essays on mountaineering are collected in a book of 1871 called The Playground of Europe. His most enduring achievement, though, is to have served between 1885 and 1891 as the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. This means, because successive volumes were published quarterly, that he was responsible for entries going from the letter A to halfway through the letter H. That was enough to get him knighted in 1902. For such a distinguished biographer, it's an irony that most biographical accounts of his life say that he is best known as the father of the painter Vanessa Bell and the writer Virginia Woolf. His intellectual impact on the young Virginia was certainly considerable, not least because, as a girl of 15, he let her roam freely through his library. In an essay about her father, Woolf wrote, "To read what one liked because one liked it, never to pretend to admire what one did not. That was his only lesson in the art of reading. To write in the fewest possible words, as clearly as possible, exactly what one meant, was his only lesson in the art of writing." So, readers of Virginia Woolf have much to thank him for. Meanwhile, we have friends of Leslie Stephen to thank for endowing this lecture held in his memory, and we have Trinity Hall to thank for holding that endowment and for co-hosting this event. The lecture has been held every other year, more or less, since 1907, with the only specification that it should be on some literary subject, including therein criticism, biography, and ethics. The first Leslie Stephen lecture was delivered, fittingly, by another biographer, Walter Raleigh. In his opening remarks, Raleigh said, "There is no finer literary model than bare matter of fact." And Leslie Stephen's style, the lean, terse style, as it has been called, constantly aimed at this perfection. There is something of the lean, terse style in much of the work of today's lecturer. There's also, it must be said, humor, warmth, and depth of feeling. Anne Enright is the author of 8 novels, 3 short story collections, 1 book of essays about motherhood, and countless reviews in the Irish, British, and American press. She was born in Dublin, where she studied at Trinity College. At the University of East Anglia, she completed an MA in creative writing under the guidance of Angela Carter and Malcolm Bradbury. Her debut story collection, The Portable Virgin, won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature in 1991. In 2007, her 4th novel, The Gathering, was awarded the Man Booker Prize. Her novel, The Green Road, bagged the Irish Novel of the Year award in 2015, and her latest novel, The Wren, won the 2024 Writers' Prize for Fiction. In 2015, Anne Enright was appointed as the inaugural laureate for Irish fiction, a role she carried out enthusiastically for 3 years. Not only is she a celebrated author, she is also reportedly a keen swimmer and an avid yoga practitioner. She has compared the discipline of writing to the discipline of yoga. Both, she says, are a practice. You turn up on the mat. It's not about theory. It's about putting words on the page and then going back day after day. It's a life. It's not her own writing or her own life that Anne Enright will be talking about today, but those of another giant of the literary world, Canadian Nobel laureate Alice Munro. When the Swedish Academy awarded Munro the Nobel Prize in 2013, it called her a master of the contemporary short story. The prize presentation speech described her stories as an emotional chamber play, a world of silences and lies, waiting and longing. This evening's lecturer, who has often written about Munro, once said about her, "She is, as a writer, constantly, thoughtfully there, able to see her characters in all their faults and to forgive those faults, or wonder at the possibility of forgiveness. Her narrators are like people you know. They are like you, actually, or a heightened, more perceptive version of you, the way they think about life and realize things late and carry on. Her stories do not ask for our praise, but for our attention. We feel, when we read them, less lonely than we were before." So, dear friends, I am delighted to welcome Anne Enright to the lectern to deliver the 2024 Leslie Stephen Lecture, A New Light on Alice Munro.
Madam Vice-Chancellor and electors, it's a great honour to be here this evening. Just before I start, this is a very difficult subject matter in this lecture, so I just want to alert people to the sensitivities at play here, and that it's all very upsetting. And to reaffirm that to discuss these matters is not in any way to condone them. And I think in the lecture, I'm quite interested in the way blame bounces away from a perpetrator to those around the perpetrator. So it's interesting as a challenge to refocus that kind of that movement away. Anyway, so in July this year, Andrea Skinner revealed not only that she had been abused by her stepfather when she was 9, but that when confronted with this truth 16 years after the fact, her mother, Alice Munro, chose to stay with and protect her abuser, Gerard Fremlin. Andrea said that she wanted these facts to become part of the stories that people tell about my mother. And this request is one that I would like to honour now. As with many revelations, Andrea's story realigns the facts already known about Munro's life so that they make more sense than they did previously. It also throws a sharp light on Munro's later fiction, where elements of Andrea's experience and all that came after it can be found in many of the stories. Some people may choose not to read the late stories. They may find it egregious that Munro both dismissed the damage done to her daughter while using it to fuel her fictions. And yet, the tug of this long-kept secret is there on the page. And as with many unpleasant discoveries, when you see it once, you see it everywhere. The word secret seems a little old-fashioned here, or even slightly magical. These events were only a secret in the sense that when Andrea told people, which she did repeatedly, they declined to publish the information or to pass it along. The first adult who did this was her father, Jim Munro, who forbade her 2 older sisters, Sheila and Jenny, to tell their mother in the year when she was 9. Jim and Alice Munro had come through a difficult separation, and the children were shuttled between their 2 homes in Victoria and Ontario. The abuse first happened during a summer visit to Ontario in 1976, and the next summer, Jim sent Andrea back again. In 1992, when she was 25, Andrea finally told her mother of the events of those summers in a slightly apologetic letter, which Munro then set on the table for Fremlin to see. She left their home in Clinton, Ontario, flying to a second home in Comox on the west coast. And when Andrea went to see her there, she was overwhelmed by her mother's sense of injury to herself. Alice Munro claimed that Jim Munro had kept the secret in order to humiliate her. She expressed jealousy of Fremlin's interest in young women and girls and was adamant that whatever had happened was between me and my stepfather. It had nothing to do with her. Meanwhile, there were frantic phone calls with Fremlin, who sent a spate of letters to the family, and after a couple of months, Alice Munro went back to live with him in Ontario. The information had come too late, she said, and she loved him too much. In 2005, Fremlin's letters were used to secure a conviction for sexual assault. He was then 80. Jenny Munro did not see her mother for 2 years around the time of the conviction. Andrea Skinner would become permanently estranged, and Fremlin died in 2013. The feeling of the world clicking into place is something often found in fiction, though sometimes in Munro's stories, knowledge, which can feel like change, doesn't actually change anything. That sense of actions having consequences turned in her late fiction either to the Gothic, that it's to death and disaster, or to nothing, the absence of change. These narrative mechanisms became more pronounced after 1992, but as early as her second book, The Lives of Girls and Women, characters absorbed terrible knowledge about themselves and others and continued on regardless. Looking back at I do not have moral scruples, she said. Looking back at her interviews, you find that Munro was always succinct and never a liar. She meant what she said if the reader had wit enough to hear it. When Open Secrets came out in 1994, 2 years after Andrea's letter, Munro said she wanted to record how women adapt to protect men. The emotional pull of the story, she said, was the strength of denial. Women have been pulled in half this way for a long time. She also said that the stories aren't about what they seem to be about. She wanted to keep them open. Perhaps this was the pun in the title, Open Secrets. And she knew people might find this sort of structurally disconcerting. I wanted to challenge what people want to know or anticipate knowing, and as profoundly, what I think I know, which is a difficult line, you might think, to maintain. Munro used personal material so freely that her eldest daughter, Sheila, couldn't tell if she'd remembered something from her childhood or read it in her mother's work. In an early story material, a woman dreads reading a story by her philandering fraud of an ex-husband and, to her surprise, finds herself admiring what he has made with the stuff of the life they once shared. The story is good because it uses lovely tricks, honest tricks. She also knows that fiction has no moral weight, even when it is well done. This is not enough, Hugo, she thinks. You think it is, but it isn't. As Munro's work became more recognised, aspects of her biography became a kind of story in themselves. Her frugal childhood in Wingham, Ontario was the basis for her most abiding stories. Her early marriage to Jim Munro and her failed attempt to be a wife provoked fictions that also rode a tide of social change for women. Many of her female characters break from burdensome circumstances by doing something rash, which they fail to regret. There is much adultery, and though her women were from the earliest stories exploited and abandoned by the men they desired, for the reader, this erotic energy still felt like truth or freedom of some kind. In the story of her writing life, the relationship with Gerald Fremlin was styled as a happy choice of location. Fremlin was someone she knew from college days. There was a cute re-meet, and after decades away, she ended up settling just 35 kilometres from her childhood home. Her return to Huron County gave her work that amazing sense of the local and facilitated those swoops of time that her short stories can contain. Fremlin was a geographer and a local historian. For the next 40 years, they toured the countryside together, enjoying a sense of place and collecting the material for her work. It was all very nicely middle-aged. And it is perhaps hard to look directly at middle age. Fremlin had never married. He had retired early at the age of 50. And he invited Alice Munro to live with him and with his elderly mother in the town of Clinton. This was a little underwhelming if you thought about it, but you didn't think about it, given Munro's distinction, her lovely good looks, and her writerly interest in sexual adventure, which was undimmed. 6 years before she met and moved in with him, Fremlin had been thrown out of the house of friends in Toronto for exposing himself to their daughter, who was then 9. There's no hint of such a person in Munro's smitten description in the letter when she re-met him in 1975. He's 50, she wrote, free, you don't say, sorry, a good man if I ever saw one, tough and gentle like in the old tire ads, and this is the big thing, grown up. 3 years into his relationship with Munro, while he was openly taunting and secretly exposing himself to her daughter, another accusation was levelled at Fremlin concerning a girl who was 14, and Fremlin denied it. Alice Munro told Andrea as much when the world blew up in 1992 and when Andrea visited her mother in Comox. At that stage, Alice Munro also briefly suspected Fremlin might have raped and murdered Lynn Harper, a 12-year-old girl whose body had been discovered in a woodland near Clinton in 1959. This plunge into the Gothic feels like something seen in Munro's fiction, but later both women tried to determine Fremlin's location at the time of the murder, and Munro spoke of finding evidence that he had been in Alaska at the time. Oddly, the mother who threw Fremlin out of her house in Toronto for exposing himself to her daughter contacted him after her divorce some years later. The early 70s were clearly an uncertain time, not just for sexual, but also for maternal mores. Munro was ambivalent about motherhood. Married at the age of 20, she had 3 pregnancies in 6 years, and one child did not survive long after birth. In 2001, Sheila Munro published a biography of her mother that seemed a little harsh when I read it. Perhaps again, Munro was just telling the truth. She said that she did not touch or hold Sheila much as a baby, that she had an easier time with the second, Jenny, and that Andrea, born when Sheila was 13, had been conceived because the contraception failed. Just before Andrea's birth, the family moved into a big house that Alice did not want, and as she told one interviewer, something broke in me then. The fact that Andrea was a late child was a complicating factor in the separation from Jim, and though Alice made great attempts to be with her youngest and to move Andrea to Ontario, it was an unhappy time for all. She was also beginning to make her mark as a writer. I am terribly grateful that I had them, Munro said of her children when her 3rd book was published in 1974. Yet I have to realise I probably wouldn't have had them if I had the choice. The next summer, she moved in with Fremlin and helped to look after his elderly mother, while Andrea moved back to live with Jim Munro during the school year. Alice Munro's father and elderly aunt were also in Huron County, and they both required care. Munro writes with such a lively interest about old people who seldom die in her work. This can be contrasted with the many, many deaths of her fictional children, almost none of whom go naturally, as her own newborn had done in 1955. Children are murdered by their parents, or they are killed by their parents by accident. They are lost in a moment's inattention. In Miles City, Montana, 1985 story, one child dies by drowning in the deep past, and another child in the present is saved. The narrator remembers how, at the funeral of the drowned child, she felt a furious and sickening disgust at the adults around her. This sense of betrayal swiftly turns from a moral to some other thing, from a moral sense into some other thing. Children sometimes have an access of disgust concerning adults. The size, the lumpy shapes, the bloated power, the breath, the coarseness, the hairiness, the horrid secretions. Elsewhere, the besetting distractedness of adults is not just dreamy, it can also be erotic, and the punishment they endure can seem excessive. These deaths of children are, in narrative terms, a little inert. They allow no middle ground when it comes to the business of blame, which is the space where most parenting gets done. Munro loved her children, but she didn't seem to want to do so as a mother. She was very pleased to have them as friends. According to Sheila, their relationship became much more enthusiastic in Sheila's adolescence when mother and daughter swapped clothes and shopped at the same store called Sweet 16. Munro told Sheila that this is part of the counterculture of the 60s. There was this big problem how to be an adult in this period, she said. I wanted to be as if I was 10 years younger. So Alice was the cool mother who gave Sheila a copy of Lolita to read at the age of 13. She wanted to value her children for their real selves, as I thought them. In this interview given to Sheila in 1998, she seemed to understand in a melancholy way that the move from Puritan to progressive values involved a vagueness, almost a kind of forgetting. Let's say I was thinking of the kind of mother I wanted to be, not what it would do to you. She wasn't the utter joy of my life she might have been, she said of Sheila in a 2004 interview in the New York Times, where she was, again, oddly frank about her children. I was emotionally more open to the second. There's no mention of a third, and much talk of Gerald Fremlin, who Munro immediately fell for, she said, when she met him at college. When I ask, as the journalist says, when I ask whether she would have gone off with Fremlin there and then, she says simply and unhesitatingly, yes. And for a moment I see the character of Pauline, the adulterous wife and mother in her 1997 story, The Children's Stay, who decides to bag an existence of married complicity to run off with her lover. This interview upset Andrea so much she filed charges against Fremlin, using as evidence the letters he had sent to the family, which led to his conviction for sexual assault in 2005. The letters claimed that Andrea had, at 9, invaded his bedroom for sexual adventure. Fremlin threatened to go public with a number of photographs taken when Andrea was 11, which he said were extremely eloquent. He said she was a Lolita who had brought ruin to two people who love each other, and his reasoning was strange. The sexual event was largely in continuity with our pedagogical theory of treating children as persons. He also talked of suicide and said that Alice was one of the greatest artists of the age. The letters had been typed and copied in triplicate. He later added notes and a colophon. In 2004, after he was charged with sexual assault, Jenny Munro sent copies to her mother, who told her she had seen but not read the letters. They were not addressed to me, she said. After this, Jenny declined to see her mother for 2 years. Munro met Fremlin as a scholarship student at the University of Western Ontario when she was 18. He was 25, a veteran of the recent war. Munro considered him something of a Byronic figure. She thought he was the editor of the college literary magazine in which he published comic verse, and she brought him a story in the hopes, she said, that he would immediately fall for her. He did not. A year later, when he graduated, he brought a girlfriend to the first reading ever given of Munro's work, a story about a man who returns to his hometown in Ontario but cannot bring himself to leave the station. Afterwards, Fremlin raised his hand and asked why she had not set the story in Wingham, her hometown. The next summer, he wrote a letter to her about her writing, a really, really appreciating, insightful letter, she said, one of the best I ever got. A classmate described Fremlin as a raging, unconventional guy and an outspoken atheist. The first time Andrea met her stepfather when she was 8, he shot down her feminist arguments that girls could do anything boys could do and reduced her to tears. Afterward, her mother said, "See, you're so intelligent, he treats you like an adult." Jenny Munro saw the triangle of Jerry, Alice and Andrea as very close and jolly, lots of banter and jokes, often sexual or scatological jokes. Jerry would encourage Andrea and Mom would feign shock. I could feel the tension and darkness there, how Mom seemed helpless to ever draw the line. Fremlin continued to write comic verse in his early retirement, and their 5-acre garden in Clinton was decorated with novelty sculptures, including a claw-footed bathtub painted to look like a Holstein cow. His death notice in the Clinton News Record described him as a philosopher, painter, and poet with a taste for the absurd, who had friends too numerous to mention. There is a single message of condolence which reads, "Uncle Jay was a favourite of his nieces and nephews as children. He'd round up all the kids and take us for long walks along the tracks. Fond memories of sleeping out under the stars while he told us stories, in particular ghost stories, complemented by his spooky sound effects and evil laugh." Much of the death notice is taken up with his war record in the Royal Canadian Air Force, where from the age of 17, Fremlin flew 37 operations in 3 different squadrons as a bomb aimer in the Second World War. This involved lying prone in a windowed front bay of a Lancaster bomber and visually directing the pilot to his target. For Canadians who flew such missions, the return rate over the course of the war was 44%. After the news of the Munro family troubles, there was much discussion in the press about Munro's 1994 story, Vandals, in which 2 young people unexpectedly trash a house because of the abuse one of them once experienced at the hands of the husband, Latner, now in hospital. There are places on the property where the young woman, Lisa, sees a bruise on the ground, a tickling and shame in the grass. It was hard for her to describe what went on. In the secret life she had with him, what was terrible was always funny. Badness was mixed up with silliness. You always had to join in with dopey faces and voices and pretending he was a cartoon monster. You couldn't get out of it or even want to. Meanwhile, she thinks that his wife, Bea, had forgiven Ladner after all, or made a bargain not to remember. The point of view slides a little between the 2 women as Lisa considers a role that Bea might have played but did not. Bea could spread safety if she wanted to. Surely she could. All that was needed was for her to turn herself into a different sort of woman, a hard and fast, draw the line sort. Sadly, what Bea was sent to do, she could not see. This play of seeing and not seeing, of knowing and nearly knowing, doesn't hang so delicately in subsequent stories. Consequences become more extreme or they cease to matter. And the question of forgiveness is rehearsed over and again. A Fremlin-like character makes several appearances, and he is almost always unremittingly unpleasant. Comfort, 2001, tells the story of a widow whose husband kills himself in the face of a terminal illness. He's a raging atheist, constantly on the lookout for the dishonouring insult of a religious reference. And the couple's arguments are devastating. They come together afterwards shaking with contrition, like people who had been walking around in naked desolation. The undertaker hands her a paper discovered in the dead man's pyjama pocket, and instead of a suicide note, she finds several verses of scathing doggerel about creationism. Typically for Munro, the undertaker is an old, if glancing, love interest. They kiss. She asks if he believes in the soul. The undertaker answers yes. This sweetness is chillingly offset by her interest in the way he's just embalmed her husband's corpse. As he describes the process, the formaldehyde injected into the veins, she feels awaken in herself a cool and spacious curiosity. That slightly dissociative sense of expansion familiar to Munro's readers as one of the pleasures afforded by her prose, especially toward the end of a story. There is satisfaction to be found in not caring. The work after 1992 contains many suicides. Home wreckers of one sort or another come into private domestic spaces. There is also, I think, a kind of movement into helplessness. Munro's women, who were once so adept at betrayal, are now more often betrayed. Their adulteries are more vengeful than lusting, and they can seem a little pathetic. There are also stories of family estrangement, in which it has to be said the mothers feel more abandoned than abandoning. The Children's Day, a 1998 story, a woman loses custody of her children as the price exacted by her husband for having an affair. She's a very typical Munro heroine. She says, so her life was falling forward. She was becoming one of those people who ran away. A woman who shockingly and incomprehensibly gave everything up. For love, observers would say wryly, meaning for sex. None of this would happen if it wasn't for sex. But though her maternal pangs are strong, and still, what pain, she says, the consequences turn out to be more felt than real, or imagined than real. In a final flash forward at the end of the story, we hear her children have grown up. They don't hate her for going away or staying away. They don't forgive her either. Perhaps they wouldn't have forgiven her anyway, but it would have been for something different. In Silence, in 2005, a different woman cannot figure out why her daughter has become estranged. You know, we always had the idea that there's this reason or that reason, and we keep trying to find out reasons. She decides it comes from something like purity in her daughter's nature, some rock-hard honesty in her. And we are left with a sense of a woman who feels both impure and alone. As a trick of storytelling, these cadences are certainly lovely, but are they honest? Denial makes a great subject, but a poor mechanism, I think, for writing stories. It has to be cleanly understood. I mean, the writer must know what they know. Although the late stories can feel a little unprocessed in the psychological sense, some of them work brilliantly, in part because of Munro's ability to show how a character feels, even if we don't approve of them. In The Bear Came Over the Mountain, 2001, Grant, an old-school philanderer, now slightly disgraced, feels shamefully duped by life. The women in his life, at one time so suddenly available, are now saying that that wasn't what they had in mind at all. They had collaborated because they were helpless and bewildered, and they had been injured by the whole thing rather than delighted. Although this line leaves a bit of a taste now, it sits properly in its context, which is a comedy of dementia manners in which Grant gets his comeuppance when his wife forgets him for another man. Dementia is an extreme, if effective, way to escape a relationship. In the same collection, The Woman in Floating Bridge is Not So Blithe. The story actually begins with the line, "One time she had left him," describing a woman at a bus stop feeling angry and a little petulant. She gives up leaving him and returns to her husband because the life she was carrying herself into might not give her anyone to be angry at or anybody who owed her anything. This man, Neil, has a sexual interest in the young offenders with whom he works, and she observes his covert excitement with forensic accuracy. It would be over some boy at the school, a mention of the name in offhand, even belittling way, a mushy look, an apologetic, yet somehow defiant bit of giggling. Now she's in chemotherapy and in a small act of revenge, kisses a young man who drives her home. This kiss feels less believable to the reader, possibly because it lacks our former erotic urgency. Do young men kiss older women like that? Martin Amis said he once kissed Iris Murdoch. Edna O'Brien said she was kissed by Jude Law. But you know, I'm not sure it's a thing. No one in these stories is a writer, and no one is famous. And this seems worth mentioning because Andrea's suffering was maintained and made worse by her mother's fame as a writer, which trapped her and everyone around her into silence over and again. Sheila Munro, that considering her mother's talent and reputation, was like looking into the Grand Canyon. By 2009, the collection Too Much Happiness, the character, that splitting that she describes of denial, that pulling apart of themselves that women do, has been fully effected. And the mechanisms of denial have succeeded. And this makes the stories feel a little blanker, a little more blank, a little more bare as a result. In Dimensions, a woman visits her husband after he has murdered their 3 children. saying, "Aren't I just as cut off by what happened as he? In deep holes, a son absents himself for no clear reasons, for many years after a childhood fall. In Child's Play, a woman remembers a crime of her childhood in which another child was drowned, yet another drowned child, and decides against seeking forgiveness. It's not for me. What's done is done. Flocks of angels, tears of blood notwithstanding." In fiction, in the same collection, a woman reads a story written by her ex-husband's ex-stepchild and recognizes her old house with a sense of foreboding. She can feel the horror coming, the innocent child, the sick and sneaking adult, that seduction. She should have known, all so in fashion these days, practically obligatory. The tone is unpleasant for reasons that do not become clear. Here, she says, was where the writer would graft her ugly invention onto the people and the situation she'd got out of real life, being too lazy to invent, but not to malign. We don't know why the narrator is so exercised, because in fact she's wrong. There was no assault either on the page or in life. The young person, the young writer, loves her. It all works out well in the end. In 2002, when Andrea refused to have Fremlin near her children, mother and daughter became estranged and they were never reconciled. Munro couldn't drive. That was one reason she gave Andrea, that she couldn't see her grandchildren without her husband. Journalists complained that it took more than 3 hours to get to Clinton from Toronto. Fremlin dropped her off to interviews one town over, and he picked her up again, wanting to know immediately how much she had had to drink. According to Margaret Atwood, Munro wasn't very adept at real life. Sheila said she was so lacking in manual dexterity she couldn't take a photograph, and that she always removed her sunglasses before crossing the street, as if she did not quite trust herself in the physical world. This seems so at odds with the lucidity of her sentences and her absolute control on the page. But Munro made very few claims for herself as a person. Other than that, she kept her figure neat. From the earliest years at school, she was just a kind of weird kid, she said, being so nervous and frightened, having no self-confidence, while at the same time having a lofty sense of superiority. When Jim Munro forbade his children to speak to their mother about Fremlin's abuse, he said that it would kill her. And this, Jenny wrote, was a familiar phrase throughout my childhood. Also, Jim Munro didn't know whether to believe Andrea. You know, little girls, how they flirt and jump around. The family mythology held it that Alice was vulnerable and Andrea problematic. And that was the narrative Alice Munro reached for when told the truth in 1992. Like a number of posters online, Margaret Atwood dropped a small question into the discussion. I wonder if a similar thing happened to her, saying, it's in the stories, and so is that kind of abuse in the lives of girls and women. This is Munro's second book, published in 1971, and it is about Dell, a girl of 12 or 13 who's smitten by an older man, Mr. Chamberlain, and she fantasizes about him constantly. He begins to assault her covertly, brutal as lightning, before taking into the woods where he masturbates in front of her. The scene is indelibly written and stretches over many pages. It ends with Dell looking at the landscape that is post-coital, distant and meaningless. Mr. Chamberlain immediately leaves town, one of many such absconding and disappearing seducers. And Dell doesn't tell anyone, not even her friend Naomi, with whom she has been having schoolgirl conversations about sex. This configuration of two schoolgirls and an older man who seduces or assaults one of them is also seen in two late stories, Queenie and Wenlock Edge, with the pervy Mr. Purvis and the irascible music teacher, Mr. Vorguilla. Munro liked and was influenced by the work of Edna O'Brien, whose book A Country Girl also contains his triangulation of two schoolgirl friends and an older man, called by O'Brien Mr. Gentleman, with whom one becomes infatuated. Dell's sexual encounter in the lives of girls and women is a world away from O'Brien's picture of two naked fools on a velveteen couch, however. Where O'Brien's girl swoons and is silly, Munro's is altogether prepared for degradation. From the outside, Dell conflates desire and damage and also ascribes to sex a kind of truthfulness. It will be, she thinks, a flash of insanity, a dreamlike, ruthless, contemptuous breakthrough in a world of decent appearances. She thinks that Mr. Chamberlain senses her criminal sensuality, her inherent lewdness, her deceitfulness. Driving her into the woods, he uses a mocking, infantile voice. Evil would never be grand with him, she writes, and he derides her use of the word sentimental. Sentimental? I don't know what those big words mean, little girl. Dell is in her first year of high school. Mr. Chamberlain is a returned veteran who awakens her interest by speaking of child prostitutes in Italy, no older than Dell here, he says. The tweaked timeline is interesting because Munro was born in 1931, so she wasn't at school in 1946 when the veterans came home. She was in her first year of university. In How I Met My Husband, published in 1974, a woman is seduced and abandoned by a glamorous veteran aviator, and she marries the mailman she meets while awaiting for the letter. His letter. There's another veteran in The Progress of Love, 1986, a Mr. Kreiderman who served in Burma. Where Mr. Chamberlain worked for the local radio station, Mr. Kreiderman works for the local newspaper. And in this story, the girl, Jessie, is 15 and her school friend is called Mary Beth. Mr. Kreiderman's interaction with Jessie is also furtive, mocking, thrilling, and shaming. But the lesson she learns from it is a little more literary, if that's the right word. The reality of his touch makes Jessie see the power of her own fantasy and also how she is trapped by it. I am a person of wizardry, but helpless, she says. Kreiderman seems to understand that for Jessie, people are hardly more than puppets, serving the glossy contrivings of my imagination. For both Dell and Jessie, these things happen because they have imagined them happening, though the reality will prove problematic. Dell and Jessie possess a terrible power that undoes consent while giving them an appalling but magical agency. They are always in charge of their own despoiling. I'm not saying that Chamberlain and Kreiderman are the same character, or that they are based on the same person or on any person. Conflating the author and the individual, the life and the work happens more to female authors than to men, as though we are in the business of fiction making more pinned to our inescapable, often physical reality. As readers, we generalize very happily about issues of marriage and domesticity, but we individualize fictions of sexual assault as though sexual assault or the threat of it were not for women a universal experience. It didn't have to be Fremlin there on the page from the beginning. There was a lot of his type about. Her real life was not among us, Sheila Munro wrote of her mother. It was on the page. In 1980, when I was 18 years of age, I walked into Munro's Books in Victoria and was guided to buy two books, The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood and Who Do You Think You Are by Alice Munro. I have read Munro all my life, and reading her again in preparation for this talk, I find I cannot take back my great love for her work. It was too freely given. Jenny Munro rightly described her mother as a dedicated, cold-eyed storyteller, saying, whether people love her fiction or hate it doesn't matter. Andrea's truth is here to stay. Thank you very much.